Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Hugh McKay, President of the Board of Directors of the City Club. As part of the City Club's 100th anniversary in our Encore Speakers Program, we're welcoming back to the City Club illustrious speakers who were with us in the past. Today, we are honored to welcome back as our first Encore speaker, Dr. Francis S. Collins. In 1996, Dr. Collins came to the podium of the City Club as head of the Human Genome Project. Following his City Club appearance, Dr. Collins received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and he was named Director of the National Institutes of Health. It is amazing what a City Club appearance will do for a career. Dr. Collins' career and achievements are truly incredible. His work in leading the successful effort to complete the Human Genome Project was an unprecedented, hugely complex, multidisciplinary scientific enterprise to map and sequence all of the human DNA instruction book. Many view the Human Genome Project as the most important scientific undertaking of our time. Dr. Collins grew up in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia on a small farm that raised sheep, and he had no indoor plumbing growing up. He received a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Virginia, a Ph.D. in physical chemistry from Yale, and an M.D. from the University of North Carolina. Following a fellowship in human genetics at Yale, Dr. Collins joined the faculty at the University of Michigan, where he remained until moving to NIH in 1993. His research has led to numerous major breakthroughs in genetic research. In 2009, Dr. Collins became the director of NIH, the nation's medical research agency and the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world. NIH's budget goes to more than 300,000 research personnel at over 3,000 universities and research institutions, and approximately 6,000 scientists work in NIH's own laboratories. Dr. Collins has received numerous awards and honors, including election to the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. And in addition to the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civil award, he was also awarded the National Medal of Science and a large number of others, too numerous to mention. Dr. Collins, who says he used to be an, quote, obnoxious atheist, unquote, has been outspoken in calling for dialogue between the scientific community and the religious community on genetic issues. He says, quote, we need ethicists and we need theologians. In the 21st century, says Dr. Collins, quote, anybody who has a heart for scientific investigation is going to find themselves in a glorious way. Certainly, Dr. Collins has found himself and helped all of us in a glorious way. Please welcome back to the City Club of Cleveland, Dr. Francis S. Collins.
Thank you, Hugh, for a very kind introduction. Although I don't know that we needed to know about the lack of indoor plumbing. That was very, very complete to put that in there. And what a privilege it is to be here at the City Club of Cleveland. And I can only assume that not too many people were here 15 years ago, or I wouldn't have gotten this invitation to return. But it's really wonderful to have a chance to address this remarkable audience, both here in this room and people who are listening to the words through radio and television, because this really is America's soapbox. Particularly want to recognize Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, who's here with us today, and who has been a wonderful supporter of the National Institutes of Health and of biomedical research, which is my topic today. And certainly, as I go through the circumstances we see ourselves in right now, I hope you will see a paradox, that we are both seeing the most exciting potential opportunities in medical research that have ever happened, and we are also facing potentially the greatest threat to being able to continue that effort because of the financial crisis that we face in this country and around the world. It's also a particular privilege to be in an audience that includes a lot of students who I look forward to meeting with after the formal events, and also particularly want to recognize, in terms of students, 3 individuals who trained in my laboratory who are now faculty members here in Cleveland, and that would be Mitch Drum and Pete Scaccieri and Anna Mitchell, who are over there next to the wall. Great to see you. They're part of my family and always will be. So I'd like to tell you a story about remarkable progress. And it's Veterans Day. We ought to pause for a minute to reflect on that. 11/11/11 is Veterans Day, a day where we should give thanks and honor those who have done so much to keep our land fair and free. And so much today we have of gratitude to offer them, some who gave the ultimate sacrifice, some who were, by their service to our country, affected in ways that causes them to face serious medical complications and challenges. Senator Brown and I were just over at the VA hospital helping to dedicate a portrait of another famous and remarkable Cleveland icon, Lou Stokes, for whom the VA Medical Center is named. Lou was there and spoke very wonderfully and generously, as you know he would if you've ever been around that congressman. I had the great privilege of testifying in front of him a few times while he was in the House for that remarkable 30 years. And it was wonderful to see the way in which this city continues to honor such a remarkable leader, even as they choose this moment to honor our nation's veterans. So what is the National Institutes of Health, and what have we done for you? Well, this is quite simply the largest supporter of biomedical research in the world, as you heard. But what does that mean? What is our mission? Our mission is twofold. It's science in pursuit of fundamental knowledge about the nature and behavior of living systems. That's the basic science part of our agenda. The kind of research which would not have any obvious commercial advantage, but which ultimately opens our eyes to potentials that you couldn't have dreamed of. Is that part working? Well, I think so, because as of this year, 135 Nobel Prizes have been given to grantees of the National Institutes of Health, most of whom were pursuing basic science, including the 3 that just won the prize a couple of months ago for their work on the immune system. So that's not a bad indicator of success, and I can't help but point out that at least 5 of those have a connection with Case Western Reserve. So you guys have done pretty well here in terms of nurturing that excellence. But the other part of our mission statement refers to the fact that we're not just playing in the lab, having fun, although we do have a good time, especially when things work and the experiment actually gives you new results, which, by the way, is a minority of the time. Most of the time you sort of wonder, what happened there? Or the tube fell on the floor, or something went wrong. But as a scientist, you get that occasional moment where something emerges from the experiment that you designed, and you realize, I just learned something that nobody except God knew before. What a moment that is, to have a little bit of glimpse of God's mind and to be able, like you've contributed just a small bit to human knowledge. That's what keeps us going. And those of us who work in biomedical research, almost to a person, were motivated by the hope that what we discovered, even if it seemed abstract at the time, might ultimately provide some benefit. And so that is reflected by the rest of our mission statement, which is the application of the knowledge from basic science to extend healthy life and reduce the burdens of illness and disability. Well, has it been working? We could sort of look at what's happened over the course of the last 40 years and say this has been a pretty amazing trajectory. Life expectancy over the last 40 years has been going up by 1 year every 6 years. That's not bad. We are all, as a result of that, likely to live a little longer because of what? Well, because of research that helped us understand the causes of disease, the ways to prevent it, the ways to treat it. As an example, deaths from heart attack, which were certainly 50 years ago a major cause of premature death, are still, of course, a huge challenge. But the reduction is more than 60% over those 40 years. Deaths from stroke have gone down by 70% in those 40 years. And that is from studies like the Framingham study in Massachusetts that has studied people now for more than 50 years, trying to identify all of the risk factors for those diseases and what we might do about it. And so when we take things for granted, like the fact that high blood pressure needs to be treated to reduce the risk of stroke, or high cholesterol needs to be treated to reduce the risk of heart attack, that comes out of NIH-sponsored research. Now, NIH is located in Bethesda, Maryland, but only about 10% of our budget is actually expended in the so-called intramural program there on that campus. It's an amazing place. Most of our dollars go out in grants to our nation's finest investigators at our nation's finest institutions. And I might say Ohio has done pretty well in that regard. And I'm proud to tell you that in an average year, we are sending out in grant dollars to the state of Ohio about $670 million. And that is because your investigators at places like Case Western Reserve and Ohio State and Children's Hospital in Cincinnati are sending in these remarkable ideas which get reviewed by the most rigorous peer review system in the world. And then the judgments are made about which of these are the most meritorious, and then a grant is awarded for 3 to 5 years for that investigator to go out and change the world and see what they can do to push back those frontiers. And that is a remarkable success story in terms of what we have learned from that endeavor. So when you hear about a breakthrough in heart disease or cancer or diabetes, asthma, hypertension, or rare disease of childhood, a neglected disease of the third world, and you hear that that breakthrough has been made at Case or at Stanford or at Harvard or at Washington University in St. Louis, you can be pretty sure that the support for that came from the National Institutes of Health. But actually, it came from you, because this is taxpayers' dollars. You support this, and your dollars, decided upon every year by the U.S. Congress and the administration in terms of what the budget will be, flow into this system. And it's a pretty good return on your investment, I might say. If you add up the dollars that it has taken to reduce heart attacks by that 60% I quoted over 40 years, the cost per American per year to achieve that is about $3.70 of NIH support, about the cost of a latte. And not even a grande latte. I think that would be a tall. If you look at what's happening now in terms of the economic consequences of NIH research, the grants that we support here in Ohio support 11,000 jobs. And these are high-quality, generally high-paying jobs, jobs that are very important to the economy, and many other jobs that are attached to that because of the biotechnology spin-offs that come from the research we support. And I'll have the pleasure this afternoon with meeting some of your entrepreneurs here in this area, many of whom very much build upon research that NIH does and then bring that forward into commercial applications, which is how the public really benefits. Overall, across the country, NIH, it is calculated, supported last year the production of $68 billion worth of economic growth, a return on investment well over twofold, simply on the basis of the way in which these dollars encourage all kinds of other actions that are good for the economy. And of course, we all are concerned about that now with good reason. I must say, when I came to this job of being the director of the NIH 2 years ago, I was not as versed in economic issues as I now am. But it's appropriate, I think, at this point for anybody to ask, if the government is spending money to support something, is it a good investment? And even if you weren't interested in advances in human health, and I suspect most of you would be pretty interested in that, you could look at the economic arguments and say, this is one of the best things that the U.S. government can do. And every time we see an achievement of a drop in illness, you can calculate what that has saved us. Every time you see cancer drop by 1%, and it's been dropping by 1% each year for the last 10 years, economists would tell you that just saved you $500 billion. So why are we excited about this, getting beyond the economics to the hope for advancing human health? I went into medicine with the hope I was going to be able to help people with illness. I got frustrated in my training about how rarely it was that I could actually sit in the room with a patient and be confident that I understood their disease or what to do about it. And that caused me to migrate in the direction of research in the hopes that maybe we'd make some advances in my career path that would have some impact. But I had no idea how rapidly this could go. It was my privilege in 1993 to be called to come to NIH to lead this fledgling effort called the Human Genome Project, this amazingly audacious idea that we might be able to read out all 3 billion letters of the human DNA instruction book. At the time we started that project, you were pretty good if you could read a couple thousand letters in a week. And to do this over the timetable that had been predicted, we had to scale that up to reading thousands of letters every second. And there were many skeptics about whether this would be possible. And it was sort of a departure for the government to take on this kind of big science effort in biology and medicine. But it was a wonderful recruiting tool for some of the best and brightest minds to join onto, because you had this sense of history, this sense that if we could accomplish this, it would change things permanently and forever. We would have that instruction book, and we would be able to build upon that for advances in medicine that otherwise would be impossible. And so over the course of those 13 years, the technology got invented if we didn't have it. People came on board who were pretty smart about how to interpret the data. I had the privilege of serving as the field marshal, or whatever you want to call it, for the 20 laboratories in 6 countries that worked together on this project, and that stopped worrying about who would get the credit, and who also decided, in a way that's changed the ethics of how we do research profoundly, to give the data away. Every 24 hours, the results of the Genome Project went up on the internet, so that anybody who had a good idea could start working on it right away. And that was unprecedented, and that has now become the norm for many of these large-scale projects that aim to try to empower the whole world community of scientists about how to go faster. The advances have been remarkable. We finished that first genome, I'm happy to say, 2.5 years ahead of schedule and $400 million under budget, and that was a marvel in Washington, D.C. But that was the beginning. That was sort of a reference sequence. We didn't really quite know how to read it. It's written in this funny language that just has 4 letters in its alphabet, A, C, G, and T. And we had to understand how that plays a role in human health and disease, and that meant we needed to look at lots of genomes from lots of people. Now, if each one of them had cost as much as the first one, we wouldn't have gotten very far. But again, the force of our technology inventors and their innovation is really remarkable. What cost $400 million for that first genome will now be done any day now for any person who's interested, who has $8,000 to spend. You can have your genome done. Now, $400 million to $8,000 in the space of 10 years. I don't know of any other technology that's advanced that quickly in terms of speed and reduction in cost, and actually increased accuracy at the same time. So what does that mean? Let me just give you one example where this is playing out, and that is in trying to understand the causes of rare diseases that previously had been outside of our purview. Let me tell you about Nick. Nick is from Wisconsin. Nick was fine when he was born, but after sort of 1.5 years, he started to get a lot of different medical problems, particularly intestinal problems, and particularly something that looked like a disease that's only supposed to happen much later in life, something called Crohn's disease, which is an inflammatory condition resulting in terrible fistulas that form between the intestines and the skin. Nick went through 100 operations in the next 2.5 years. He could not eat normally without setting off an inflammatory response. He was fed parenterally, but he was clearly losing ground. Nobody could come up with an answer for what was going on. And finally, his doctors decided, well, let's just look at his DNA sequence and see if there's any possible explanation. So in one of the first cases then, where DNA sequencing was applied to try to solve a medical mystery, Nick had his DNA analyzed, and it turned out that he had a very significant mutation in a gene on the X chromosome. And it was a gene that people didn't know very much about. And actually, the only time this had ever been associated with a problem was actually with a bone marrow disease, not with an intestinal problem. Again, with no other options, with much discussion with Nick's parents, the physicians decided to try a bone marrow transplant, hoping that by providing this little boy with bone marrow from an individual who did not have that genetic glitch, the problem might be resolved. That was done 1.5 years ago. Nick is in regular school. Nick had a hamburger last night, I was told. Nick played t-ball all summer. He is a essentially normal little kid, other than having to take some of the medicines you need after a bone marrow transplant. So this is a remarkable success story. And without the DNA sequence, Nick would not be with us. Now, I'd like to see that extrapolated hundreds, thousands, millions of times. And the technology moves us in the direction of that possibility. Take cancer. Cancer is a disease of DNA. It comes about because of mistakes in that instruction book. Some of them happen because you've inherited them from a parent. Most of them, though, happen during your life in a particular cell that makes a mistake in copying the DNA, maybe influenced by some environmental toxin that you got exposed to, or maybe just a mistake that your enzyme didn't quite get that copying thing right. But we have not, until very recently, been able to look comprehensively to see in a cancer what's really wrong there. We've had to do what the guy did after he lost his keys late at night and was searching for them, look under the lamppost. For us, that was looking at candidate genes that we thought might be involved in cancer. Now we can light up the whole street. The ability to look at the entire genome in a cancer is being done at a prodigious rate. We're essentially right now in the midst of doing 20,000 human genome projects focused on cancer. Each one of those involves looking at the DNA of a tumor that an individual has developed, comparing that to their normal DNA from a blood sample, and saying, what's different here? And we are learning prodigiously rapidly things about what it is that drives a good cell to go bad and causes the appearance of a cancer in a way that helps us almost immediately identify interventions that we wouldn't have thought of, and to come up with new ideas about drug targets that we didn't know about before. And again, in that case, I can tell you a number of dramatic examples of people who had already failed chemotherapy, who had widespread metastatic disease, and who, upon having their tumor sequenced and seeing that that particular tumor had a particular glitch that allowed you to match that to a targeted therapy, saw a dramatic positive response. We haven't cured cancer yet in most people. Whether we'll be able to cure it or whether we'll be able to convert it to a chronic disease is something that scientists talk about a lot. But the fact that we're having that conversation in really elegant molecular ways is a drastic change from where we were 10 years ago. I can't help but point out to one other dramatic advance from all of this that was particularly contributed to by people here in Cleveland. And that's the story of what's happened with cystic fibrosis. My lab had the privilege of working on the cystic fibrosis problem back in the 1980s. And Mitch Drum, back there, my first graduate student, was part of the team that, together with some other people in the lab and a close collaboration with a lab in Toronto run by Lapchi Choi, found that gene in 1989. And we had high hopes that that would be a circumstance where gene therapy would be the approach that would work for kids with this serious disease. 30,000 people in the U.S. have cystic fibrosis, and while the lifespan has greatly extended over the last 30 or 40 years by a whole host of interventions and now stands at age 37, we still don't have what you would call a molecularly designed effective intervention, or we maybe didn't until last week. Out of that study of the gene, with much effort that you can't underestimate the complexities of what is involved, we have learned what that normal function of that gene is. It makes a protein. What does that protein do? Well, it's a chloride channel. And what's wrong with that protein when you have cystic fibrosis? Well, it depends on which particular misspelling of the gene you have. All of that hard work, making animal models, coming up with ideas about ways to interfere with the function of the gene when it's not doing what it's supposed to. Over many, many years of work, that has now led to, just last week, the publication of a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, probably the most prestigious medical journal, of a phase 3 trial of a molecular therapy for cystic fibrosis for individuals who have a particular type of mutation called G551D. And when I read that paper, even though I heard about this over many months because of the way in which I've stayed in touch with this field and I knew things were going well, when I read that paper, I just had chills because you could see the kids given this treatment were not only showing some improvement in their lung function, and they were showing dramatic improvement in their lung function, their sweat chlorides, which is the usual measure of cystic fibrosis, were going down to normal. And they were gaining weight, which is a really important sign that this is working. Pam Davis, who's here at the head table, Dean at Case Western, wrote a wonderful editorial in the New England Journal which pointed out that this was not a flash in the pan. This was this long series of hard-won steps. But what a wonderful paradigm this is for our hopes of doing similar things for those thousands of diseases that don't yet have this kind of outcome, but could. And here's where I want to particularly then focus on the opportunity to do that kind of translation. We have this plethora, this deluge of wonderful discoveries about the basic causes of disease. And that's true for rare diseases, and it's true for common diseases. In the last 4 or 5 years, we've discovered more than 1,000 places in the genome where there are subtle variations that predispose people to diabetes or cancer or heart disease. And those are bright lights telling us, here's a pathway that must be involved in this disease and why it happens. But if you look at the timetables that are often involved in going from that discovery to having that approved therapeutic, for CF, you've just heard, 22 years. The average, even for a common disease where there's hundreds of millions of dollars being put into the effort, is 14 years. And the failure rate is 99%. That is not acceptable. If you were an engineer and you were asked to look at this problem and you heard that the pipeline in going from the start to the finish took 14 years and failed 99% of the time, would you say, well, that's okay, we can work with that? I don't think so. No, I think you would say, okay, let's figure out what are the bottlenecks here and what can we do about them. And here's a place where the National Institutes of Health, I believe, has a unique moment in history with some unique scientific opportunities to work with the private sector, to work through some of those bottlenecks and speed up the process of going from a discovery to a therapy and to reduce that terrible failure rate. How could we do that? Well, there's a number of those bottlenecks that could be tackled. We had a remarkable workshop last week at NIH where I invited the heads of research and development for the largest pharmaceutical companies to come and join with our senior and lead scientists to talk about, is there a way to pick the right targets for the next generation of drug treatment? Because oftentimes that's where the problem is. You pick the wrong target, you develop a drug, you go through all these tests, animal toxicity, you go to human toxicity, and finally you get to that moment where you try to find out, did it actually help the disease? And about 2/3 of the time right now, the answer is no. And you've spent by that time already maybe a decade. And the answer is no. And you've blown hundreds of millions of dollars because you picked the wrong target. We could do better because we have some of these tools to enable us, by studying not necessarily animal models, but humans, what exactly would be the way to go. Cystic fibrosis is a great example. That succeeded because we knew what the target was. And although it was very much on the leading edge of possibility, it's now much more feasible. You could go after that target, and you would know that you had developed something that was going to hit the right spot. We could do that for diabetes and heart disease and cancer now in ways that we could not have a few years ago. So that's one thing. Another one, how about the way in which we test to find out whether a compound is going to be safe in humans? If you're part of a clinical trial, you'd like to be pretty sure before you take that pill that it has a reasonably good safety profile. Well, how do we know that? The way we've done this for 20 or 30 years is to use animals. And we use small animals and we use large animals, and we give the drug or the biologic to them, and we watch to see if anything looks not quite right. And if it looks not quite right, that's the end of the project. Even though it might have been a compound that would have been the next cure for cancer, it's dead as soon as it causes a problem in a mouse liver. Well, this isn't right. Surely we ought to have a better system than that. And clearly it works wrong in the other way, that we have compounds that look like they were going to be safe, and then they go to a human, and the very first couple of volunteers who get the drug get sick. So shouldn't we be doing testing of toxicity in a better way? We have partnered up now with DARPA, the Department of Defense's Advanced Research Project Agency, the group that brought you the internet and GPS and a few other things that are pretty useful, to see whether in a 5-year period, with $70 million from the Department of Defense and $70 from the National Institutes of Health, could we come up with a very high-tech bioengineered chip on which we would load human cells, 10 different types, liver cells, heart cells, muscle cells, brain cells. Where would we get those? Well, we've learned how to take a skin biopsy from any one of you and develop it into those cell types by giving the right combination of tweaking. So we could do that not just for a random person, but we could do that for hundreds of people. And we could not only assess, does this drug make those cells unhappy, But does it make it unhappy for everybody, or are there some people who are more susceptible? We could begin to get a sense about the differences between individuals before the drug ever went into an actual person walking around. This is enormously exciting. It's right out there on the edge of the doable, but I think it is doable. And it's the kind of thing which would not happen if you simply wait for something good to come along. And companies love this, but they're not going to be the ones in any single company to do this. A third opportunity. Every company has in their freezers now, pharmaceutical companies, hundreds of compounds that they have abandoned because they didn't quite make it through. And many of those have already been in clinical trials. They've already been given to humans. They're already known to be safe, but they were in this category that didn't work, where the efficacy was turned out not to be what they had hoped for. So those are incredibly useful compounds. And as we're learning more and more about the molecular causes of disease, the chance to rescue those for a new application gets wider and wider. If you think this sounds unlikely, the first drug that actually showed benefit for HIV/AIDS, AZT, remember that? AZT was not developed for HIV/AIDS. It was developed for cancer. It didn't work for cancer. It went in the freezer. And then when we had this national priority to do something for HIV/AIDS, somebody thought, well, let's try that. And it worked, and it had already been through human toxicity testing. It was known to be safe. And so in 3 years, we had approval of AZT for HIV/AIDS. If that worked in that one serendipitous example, I'm convinced it could work for dozens of examples if we had the opportunity to liberate all those compounds and make them accessible for new uses. And companies are extremely interested in that idea, with NIH serving as an honest broker, a matchmaker between compounds that are looking for uses and diseases that are looking for compounds. And I believe that's another major opportunity NIH could pursue. This is, these three reasons and others, is one of the motivations behind the effort to establish at NIH a new center, a center called the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences, to bring together the expertise, the capabilities, some of these programs that have already made great strides but haven't been actually put under the same roof, brought together in a fashion that would build on their synergisms. And that is now an effort which has been endorsed by the President, supported by the Senate of the United States, still awaits a decision by the House about whether they are in favor of this, but which I am hopeful could get underway even in the course of the next couple of months. Science is ready. People with diseases are waiting. We have a chance for a new paradigm here, working with our colleagues in industry to try to do something about that pipeline, to knock down those barriers and to really transform the way in which we develop new therapeutics. Final thing I want to say is that even with this remarkable set of scientific opportunities, we are also facing real challenges. With our current economic situation, with the federal deficit very much and appropriately so on everybody's mind. This past year was only the second time in 40 years where the budget for the National Institutes of Health was cut. And it's not clear what the trajectory is going forward, but people are talking about not just a bad year, but maybe a bad decade for support of biomedical research. I promise you that I and the other leaders of the 27 institutes and centers are looking with unflinching eyes at our portfolios for research and making sure that we are investing in the opportunities that have the greatest potential, as best we can tell. And of course, it's not always possible to be sure. But I worry most of all about young researchers who are coming into our field with their best and brightest ideas, ready to go, setting up their laboratories, sending us their grant applications, and hoping that there is something they can do to contribute to this revolution that we are on the cusp of. Over the last 40 years, such an investigator sending their grant to NIH would on the average have about 1 chance in 3 of getting funded. And that was pretty rough, because that meant there were 2 chances in 3 you weren't. But actually, I think our community worked with that, recognized that this is a meritocracy, and that if you want to be supported by the National Institutes of Health, you really have to have things that are very much on the cutting edge. And that was a stable, supportable environment. We had a wonderful doubling of the National Institutes of Health budget between 1998 and 2003. And that made it possible for many universities to expand their faculties of researchers just at the moment where science was breaking out with opportunity. And that has been a wonderful boon in terms of our workforce. But then we sort of hit a plateau. And actually, given inflation, which erodes our buying power, we are now, in 2011, about 20% down where we were in 2003, with this concern that we may be headed further down from that. We do everything we can to try to support researchers, but that chance of success, which, remember, used to be 1 in 3, is now 1 in 6. And that gets to the point where, particularly for a young researcher, if you've failed to get that grant supported after 2 or 3 cycles, you begin to wonder, am I really supposed to be doing this? I will be doing everything I can, as long as I have the privilege of leading NIH, to particularly support those young researchers, because they are our future. They're our most important resource. We can have great ideas, but if we don't have their energies and their vision and their fearlessness to take on tough projects, then we're not going to get anywhere. But we do need, I think, to figure out all kinds of other ways to try to keep this engine of discovery going. It is wonderful that there are heroes in the U.S. Congress who see the potential here, and one of them is here with us today. But it is a challenging time, for sure. So, to end where I began, we're at a paradoxical time. Never have any of us seen a more exciting opportunity for research in all kinds of areas. And I could have mentioned many others, maybe especially because it's Veterans Days. I should have mentioned things that we're doing in neuroscience for traumatic brain injury, for instance, a hugely important problem. Or maybe I should have mentioned preventing premature birth, or what we're doing about diabetes prevention, or what we're doing in the global health arena with so many opportunities. Hillary Clinton came to NIH 3 days ago and said, we are on the cusp of being able to claim the possibility of an AIDS-free generation. Nobody dared say that until this week. And we have the science to say that is actually possible, not with things we're waiting to have developed 20 years from now, but for tools that we have now. All of those things are there. And yet it is with some trepidation that all of us look at this situation and worry about whether we can keep the momentum going. It's a privilege to have a chance to speak at the City Club about that and to have an audience to hear these issues. Finish with a quote from Thucydides, a Greek philosopher who also wrote about sort of difficult times, but challenging and exciting times. Thucydides, maybe thinking of Veterans Day, wrote, "But the bravest are surely those who have the clearest vision of what is before them, glory and danger alike, and yet notwithstanding go out to meet it." We at the NIH are ready to go out and meet it, and we appreciate your support and your interest. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to an Encore Speakers Forum featuring Dr. Francis S. Collins, Director of the National Institutes of Health. We will return to Dr. Collins in a minute for the traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate your questions now. Please remember to keep them brief. As we celebrate our 100th birthday, we will be actively soliciting support from the community through our campaign for a new century. To learn more about our 100th anniversary, including our school's essay contest that's upcoming, visit the City Club website, www.cityclub.org/100. And please, if you're not a member of the City Club, become a member of the City Club. We welcome all of you here and those listening to WCPN 90.3 FM, WCLV, WTAM, or one of the many radio stations across the country. Our television broadcast partner is WVIZ PBS Idea Stream. Television broadcasts of the City Club are made possible by Cleveland State University and PNC. Our live webcast is supported by the University of Akron. We're pleased to welcome guests at tables hosted by several companies and organizations. Please refer to your program for a full list of table sponsors, and we thank you for joining us today and sponsoring tables. Today's program is sponsored by Case Western Reserve University. At the head table today is Dr. Pam Davis, Dean of Case Western Reserve School of Medicine. Will you please stand and be recognized? We're also pleased to welcome students who are here as part of the City Club student program. Participation of these students is made possible by a generous grant from the Charles Spar Charitable Trust. With us today are students from Vermilion High School and St. Joseph Academy. Will you students please stand and be recognized? Now we'd like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Program Director Carrie Miller and Phil Williams, Special Initiatives Coordinator. First question, please.
Hello. Thank you very much for being here. And first of all, I wanted to thank you on behalf of the NIH for helping my daughter who had a brain tumor. And Doctors Warren and Wayne Chu were very helpful in consulting with us when we had the problem. So I know firsthand the benefits of the research you do. But I wanted to find out from you what your thoughts were on stem cell research and where that stood today.
I'm glad to hear this was something that helped your daughter, and certainly glad to answer your question. Stem cell research is one of the most rapidly moving and exciting fields. I don't think any of us anticipated just how much flexibility human cells would have to move from one cell type to another. We all kind of figured that once a cell, for instance, has matured into being a skin cell or a blood cell, that's kind of an irreversible step, and it's not going to go back in time. We were wrong. When Shinya Yamanaka published a paper just 4 years ago, it completely blew away all of our preconceptions about this whole issue of cell differentiation. Because he showed, first in mouse and then a year later, at the same time Jamie Thompson achieved the same goal, that you could take a human skin cell, you could add just 4 genes to it, not just any 4 genes, pick them carefully, and you could convince that cell to become what you call pluripotent, that is, to have the potential to turn into any kind of cell. When I was talking about this chip to test for toxicology, it's that technology that I'm referring to. This opens up a whole world of opportunity. My lab is already in this. We study diabetes. One of the organs where the diabetes problem is most difficult to study is the pancreas. That's the place that makes insulin. But it's impossible to get cells from somebody who's walking around from their pancreas. You wouldn't want me to propose that to you. On the other hand, we can take now skin biopsies from people, normal people, people with diabetes, with their permission, and we can turn those into pluripotent cells, and then we can coax them into becoming pancreatic cells that make insulin. And we can study what we needed to without doing anything invasive other than a little pinch of your skin, or we could have used a blood sample. So this potential for understanding basic biology is phenomenal. But is it also a potential for therapeutics? Well, we have already seen the implementation of 3 clinical trials in humans of human embryonic stem cell research for spinal cord injury and for 2 different eye diseases. But I think the hopes that many people have is that this ability to create these induced pluripotent stem cells, the ones I was just talking about that you can make from your own skin, would be an even greater advance because they're your cells. You don't have to worry about a transplant rejection if you start with your own cells, but you've turned them into the cells you need. And we at NIH have just started a Center for Regenerative Medicine to try to speed up that process of turning that potential into real clinical trials, using the resources of our clinical center, a 240-bed research hospital in Bethesda, to be able to test out these ideas. It's going to be a very exciting few years. So I appreciate the question. This is one of those many areas, but maybe one near the top of the list, where things are happening that you could not have imagined just a few years ago.
Dr. Collins, during the 15 years since you last spoke to the Cleveland City Club, there have been these phenomenal improvements in the whole medical area, which you described so well today. At the same time, and certainly recently, there have been a few dark clouds that have appeared on the scene. I'm referring to the frequently personal and sometimes strident attacks upon scientists. I'm thinking about attacks upon people who question the whole matter of evolution, and also on attacks on people who speak in favor of global warming, what can be done about it. My question is, to what extent do you feel those attacks, sometimes very scurrilous and sometimes really very serious, are having an effect upon recruiting the kind of people that you need and you should have to work in the area of research?
That's a great question and a sobering one. It is sort of a strange circumstance that the United States seems to be particularly the place where the debates about science and faith are the most heated. As was mentioned in the introduction, I started out as an atheist. I'm now a believer. I became a believer at age 27 based on actually rational arguments that led me to conclude that belief in God was a much more rational choice than the alternative. But I'm not necessarily welcomed by some of the scientific community in terms of that view. And I think differences of opinion are terrific. That's what makes discourse interesting. But we have somehow in this country a circumstance where the extreme voices that tend to demonize the alternative view have the majority of the time in front of the microphone or in the bookshelves. And we see circumstances where there are members of my own scientific community who are using science as a club over the head of believers, basically saying that they should just get over it, that science makes God no longer necessary. And at the other extreme, we have fundamentalist views that find science's conclusions about the age of the earth and about the relatedness of species to be unacceptable because it doesn't mesh with their particular reading of the Bible, even though people over hundreds of years have had different views about what Genesis 1 and 2 is telling us. And that tension really has, I think, gotten in the way of what we as a society would hope to be able to achieve, because I think it does drive some young people away from the scientific opportunities they might otherwise seek. I frequently get emails from people who are raised in very traditional Christian schools, many of them homeschooled or schooled in a Christian high school, who find when they get to college that the evidence in favor of evolution is actually extremely compelling. I think most of us who are biologists who have looked at the evidence would say, we know about as much to support evolution as we do to support gravity. It's not the sort of thing that you can look at and go, well, you could look at it another way if you're going to really consider the science. But that is a crisis opportunity for many of those young people. And I fear that we are losing some of their talents because that is such a moment of crisis that a natural reaction is to say, well, I just don't think I want to work in this field. My head's going to explode. My faith matters to me. The only way I'm going to preserve it is to do something else and go into some other area. You mentioned climate change as another area of tension. And there again, it is very troubling when one sees scientists who have devoted their efforts to collecting evidence about climate change and about whether or not human involvement is involved. And when you see the National Academy of Sciences drawing very strong conclusions that, yes, human involvement is involved, and yet this becomes an issue where scientists are attacked in some cases in a pretty damaging way from a political perspective. I know it's our society, and free speech is really important, and it should be the opportunity to have these discussions. But when honest, well-meaning people who are trying to basically derive evidence are demonized this way, then I think we should all look at that and say, that's not what our society is supposed to be supporting. Let's talk about the facts and not talk about what we wish the facts were. We have to be unflinching in our ability to look at the truth and then figure out what to do with it.
Dr. Collins, about 3 years ago you were on our campus, and I spoke to you a couple days later about brain disorders, particularly schizophrenia and bipolar, and some of the work that's being done. We don't talk much about these, and yet they impact our society unbelievably. We talked about the help of early diagnosis and management, and all that goes along with this huge, huge number of silent patients. Can we be hopeful?
I think you can. NIH has an entire institute, the National Institute of Mental Health, focused on this set of concerns and these disorders, which, as you rightly point out, cause enormous suffering to individuals, to their families, enormous expense to society, and for which we still don't have adequate interventions or preventions. There are a lot of things to point to that I think can lead to some sense of optimism. The whole area of neuroscience is also because of some new technologies just breaking open now. Our ability to understand how the brain is wired and how, in the case of schizophrenia or autism, things are not wired in quite the same way has to be the first step in understanding what kind of intervention might work. We're understanding about the genetic factors. And for schizophrenia, we've gone from knowing no genetic factors to now almost a dozen. For where we know there are variations in the DNA that predispose an individual to a higher risk of that disease. The risk may not be that high from the variations we've learned about, but they point you towards potential pathways that must be involved in the disease. When I talk about the need for a focus on translation, when I say that, I'm thinking about schizophrenia, I'm thinking about depression, I'm thinking about autism, because those are all opportunities that are crying out for this kind of application, and which are still so early in the process that they're not going to be invested in very heavily by the private sector until we're further along in having something that looks like it could end up as a commercial product, which means it's NIH's job. And it's the academic investigators who are interested in those diseases, and there are lots of them, that we need to support to make those next breakthroughs.
The grand challenge of personalized medicine and perhaps much of translational science might be to understand individuals scientifically. Yet we're kind of saddled with a regulatory science which in effect washes out the effects of individual differences. Are you taking any initiatives to understand individuals scientifically?
Absolutely. So, yeah, you're singing my song here, because I have a whole book called Personalized Medicine. Yeah, absolutely. If we're going to make headway, we've got to stop thinking of ourselves as sort of the one-size-fit-all kind of circumstance, because we are all different. And that means that the way in which prevention might work for me might not work for you. If I get diabetes, my intervention might not be the same as yours if you have diabetes. And so we have to factor that in. And you mentioned regulatory science, because, of course, if we're going to go down the road of doing good research and coming up with interventions, we have to be sure those get approved and brought into the mainstream. Peggy Hamburg, who's the commissioner of the FDA, and I formed a joint leadership council of FDA and NIH almost as soon as we both got appointed to our current positions. And we have been working hard with the center directors at FDA and my institute directors to try to knock down some of the barriers that are getting in the way between NIH research and the regulatory science incorporating that into decision making. And I would say at FDA one of the highest priorities is to try to figure out how to get into a more individualized kind of process wherein a drug is put forward. It is not just a drug that's applied to everybody willy-nilly, but you have a subset of people for which you have molecular reasons to think this is going to work. Let me give you an example. Crizotinib is a new drug for lung cancer. If you gave this drug to 1,000 people with lung cancer and compared it to standard chemotherapy, you would probably not be very impressed. But if you picked the 5% of people with lung cancer who have a translocation of a gene called ALK, those people will have dramatic and sustained full remissions in what looks like stage 4 metastatic disease because you've figured out the match, the personalization. That is a critical message. And FDA gets that, even though it's been, I think, relatively recent on the scene. And it's a complicated process. I wouldn't run the FDA for anything. Has anybody ever, Senator, has anybody ever held an FDA hearing to congratulate them on their good work? I don't... They should, though, you know. Here are the people that are protecting the food supply and making sure that when you get a drug from your doctor, it's been tested and it's safe and effective. And sure, is there a zero risk in this situation? Not that I could think of, so things are occasionally going to go wrong. But what a job they have to do.
Dr. Collins, as a father of a former homeschooler, I want to welcome you to Cleveland. The former director, when he was stepping down, Elias, wrote an editorial at New England Journal of Medicine asking for a new vision. Mm-hmm. And the question he had was how we can do better by, during his tenure, we had to spend $30 billion a year or so to come up with a massive amount of basic science discovery, whereas the clinical practice had seen very little effect. So he was asking how we can find more applications for the major basic science discovery. Where me as a surgeon scientist, as wear both hats, I think the vision maybe is the other way around. How we can untangle the clinical complexity that we have and really find the basic science application for our clinical problems. And I'm not sure, serving on the study sections, that has transcended through the rank and file of the study sections. Still, the study sections are very pro-mechanistically driven, and if you can't find the last molecule, it's going to be out the door. I was curious about the commenting on that, how we can flip this arrow around.
So yes, my predecessor, Elias Zerhouni, who I guess decided his way to deal with this is to go and be the head of R&D for Sanofi Aventis, which is where he now is, and doing a great job there. He points out correctly that the idea that success in medical progress is not a unidirectional traveling from a basic discovery to a therapeutic implication. This is a pathway that needs to keep circling back. And sometimes the greatest breakthroughs are when you start with the clinical problem and then circle back to understand the molecular cause. I think one could say cystic fibrosis again as a good example. My introduction to cystic fibrosis was as a disease. It was that inspiration that led to the desire to find out what's causing this and ultimately to get the molecular answer, then to figure out how to go forward. And now we need to go back again and figure out how we can help the rest of the patients with CF who don't respond to this specific drug so that ultimately we have everybody cured. Study sections are both the most amazing invention at NIH. They are the reason why we do such great research, but they're not perfect. And we're constantly trying to see if there's ways that we can make them even better. And your point about being sure that they're holistic in their view of science and not compartmentalized is a critical one.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we've been listening to a Friday forum featuring Dr. Francis Collins, Director of the National Institutes of Health. Thank you, Dr. Collins. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.